Right. Well, good snowy morning. I'm going to start off and then Joe's going to take all the hard stuff. I've got the good news. Um, Looking at granting for next year, the granting cycle for FY26 opens a week from today, April Fool's Day, April 1st. So maybe the surprise that day will be 70 degrees and sunshine. Who knows? But the cycle does open next Monday, and that is open through July 31st when it closes. We expect, the funny thing is the commission does, as most of you know, granting a year at a time. So we don't award all of the funds in one fell swoop in the biennium. That allows for important projects that come up. Well, they're all important projects, but things, for instance, like acquisitions that are somewhat time sensitive. Doing an annual grant cycle works better, we think, for our constituents. So the first year of the grant cycle is a little awkward because we don't really know exactly how many dollars we have available for granting. So we go based on crystal balls, best guesses, and estimates. Generally, the budget for next year we won't have a great idea about it until the November forecast, though we'll have some sort of idea in May. But right now, our best guess for grant dollar availability is $12 million in FY26. I'd expect that number will probably go up, but that's a nice, it's a solid estimate on the low side of things because the collections, as we all know, have been going up pretty well over the past several years. And so along with that, it looks as though we are going to have an additional almost $2 million available in FY25 funds. Now, those funds become available for those that applied in the FY25 cycle on July 1 of 2024. And the reason we're going to have some additional funds available is we were able to recoup some grant dollars that were not spent in one of our grant projects from the past couple of years. As well, we've got a $25,000 almost rebate, if you will, coming back from the Department of Natural Resources. They are not going to be collecting the 2.5% administrative fee on our operating budget. So those funds are coming back to us as well. And then we were holding back about $33,000 anyways in this grant cycle for emerging opportunities that may become available. So along with that, we've also, with help, guidance, and hard work of Elizabeth Wafel with Flaherty and Hood, have a bill moving through the legislature right now that would distribute the surplus legacy funds in this year rather than waiting until the first year of the next biennium. And that would be an additional almost $1.8 million. The surplus is quite a bit greater than we had anticipated. So that comes up to almost just shy of $2 million. So those funds will be an additional granting process that still to come as to when those are released. We don't want to be confusing with the grant cycle we're currently in. However, we do want to acknowledge that there may be some needs from folks who have run into problems like estimates for projects going above what were anticipated, maybe some acquisitions that are coming up, or just generally what we'd really like to see are some exciting connecting people with the outdoors projects as well. So we'll be talking more about that at our commission meeting on Wednesday of this week. But for now, it's really great news that there's an additional $2 million on top of what was already this past grant year, a record amount of dollars available to grant $16 million. So the great news for Legacy and Greater Minnesota is those funds continue to grow and continue to make huge improvements and investments in parks and trails across the state. Something to really be proud of, and something that we've been hearing in a really positive way from legislators as we've been spending time in the House and the Senate committees. They're very complimentary of the work that we're doing. So that's great for all of you to hear too, because the projects that you bring out and the work that's done it's impressive and it's well noted. So that's all good news about what is upcoming. And right now, I'll wait until questions. That kind of sets the stage for Joe to talk about the funding cycle and improvements that we've made again to the process to apply for those funds. So, Joe.
All right, thank you very much, Renee. I am just going to share our screen from our website because that's what all of you are probably going to be looking at if you want to apply for funding. So I just thought I'd show around some of the new things that we have available and help to get you acquainted with everything. So assuming you can all see my screen at this point, I will go from our homepage here, gmrptcommission.org, to our applications tab. For those of you who have applied before, you're pretty familiar with this. The apply here button, that's where you can enter to apply for funding if you are a designated facility. Where I'd like to actually start though is our application toolbox. If you haven't been into our application toolbox, which is this button here under the apply button, this is probably the most important part as far as what information do you need to know about the application process for this year. Excuse me. So let's take a look on the right-hand side here. We have the funding applications column. This is all the information, criteria, instructions, tutorials that you will need. Just to run through it quickly, the first document is the guidelines and criteria document. This lists out how we score funding applications, as well as what is and is not eligible. So you want to take a look at this. I'll go through this in just a couple of minutes because there's some new things that you should be aware of for this year for the funding process. Below that, we have a couple of tutorials that are new, funding or video tutorials. The first one, what's new in 2024 video, just recaps some of the changes we made for this year and how to think about this year's funding application process, very specific towards this year's cycle. And the one below that is the more in-depth video tutorial for how to complete an application. So if you haven't applied in a couple of years or you haven't applied at all, you definitely want to take a look at least that second video along with some of the other information here. And just like we've done in the past, the instruction document, the fourth one on this list here, that provides for you all of the information that is in our application, online application portal. So what items are we looking for? What are the instructions for all of those items? Everything that you would need to complete your online application is available for you in a Word document or PDF document so that you can go through it on your own time, in your own manner, with your own groups of people that need to be working on your document. Below that, we have a non-infrastructure project management policy that deals with connecting people to the outdoors types of projects. We do expect to see some updates to that yet as of tomorrow's commission meeting. So you may see that updated for 2024. And then just some general information below that, our content standards, which is taken from our strategic plan. 3 items having to do with our budget spreadsheet, which did change for this year. So be sure to grab the new template for the budget spreadsheet. And then finally, probably one of the most important pieces is the funding resolution. This is the required language. Make sure that you've got the most updated language for your city or your county to complete that required resolution. And that is the one thing that absolutely must be done, completed, signed, sealed, delivered by the funding application deadline, along with the application by July 31st. So be sure that that is in. All right, so just to keep the fun going before I get too carried away with lists and documents, which aren't necessarily all that fun, I will open here the funding guidelines and criteria so we can talk just a little bit about some of the changes for this year. Under the bottom of the first page, under the application notes for 2024, there's certain things that you should be aware of for this year. One is that, similar to last year, but I think growing in calls for this type of funding, we are setting aside funding for what we now call environmental projects or environmental planning work. So you can apply for up to $50,000 in legacy funding with a required minimum 20% local match that can go towards your archaeological surveys, SHPO, TIPO, environmental, any sort of environmental pre-planning work or worksheets, or other types of collaboration having to do with that sort of pre-construction development work. The reason we think this is important and why it's a response to what we're hearing is that we all know expenses and timelines for this sort of work have gone up substantially over the last few years. So if you've got an idea that in a year, 2, 3, 4 years out, you might be going after a certain construction project, but you're worried about getting into it and finding out there may be delays because of archaeological work or something like that, apply for that funding now, get that work done. And then once you know what your plan can be, because you know where any certain sensitive sites or environmental issues are, you can apply for a construction project that deals with it instead of having to try and fix it after you have the grant in hand and incurring costs you didn't expect. So those environmental planning surveys are important, I think, for many agencies. I did mention that the budget spreadsheet did change. We did simplify it a bit this year. We took out a level of detail. We still want you to identify what your line items costs are for your project on a fairly fine-grained level, but we're not requiring you to identify what the source of funding is split between legacy or local matches. We're just saying, here's your total cost and show us how much is local match and how much is your legacy grant request. So that should simplify that for you a little bit. Third bullet there, we're seeing this more and more as project timelines tend to get spread out. We're dealing with larger projects. There's a lot of inflation issues. There's a lot of, like we said, those environmental preparedness issues. So we're taking a little bit harder look at just how shovel ready a project may be. So take a look at your timeline, your project scope, your project budget, your mapping and schematic design. All of those pieces are in place to help make sure that you've thought through your project so that if we fund you, you can get it done in the 3-year grant timeline that would start the following July 1st or shortly after and go 3 years out from there. So we want everybody to be successful and spending a little bit more time making sure that you're ready for the project and we know you're ready for it can be an important point for you getting funded. So keep that in mind. If you have questions about that, be sure to reach out and ask us. So for those of you who may have a regional park or trail that has rental facilities that you will rent out on a seasonal basis, whether it be campground, campsites, or maybe you've got a marina with docks that you rent out on a seasonal basis, or even potentially some picnic facilities, shelters, what have you. The commission now has a policy that no more than 20% of those seasonal rental facilities, and quite honestly, this is mostly going to be campgrounds, no more than 20% of those rental facilities can be seasonal. If you're above that 20%, you can still apply for legacy funding, but we just will not fund any more of your campgrounds or docks or whatever is allowable on a seasonal basis until you get that percentage to or below 20%. The commission's philosophy, and I think it's been well known, we're all about outdoor natural resource-based recreation that is open, accessible to the public. And to be able to really pull that off, you need to have some turnover, some ability for people to get into campgrounds and into marinas on a weekend basis or for a week stay and have those facilities open to the public. So that's the reason for that particular policy change. And then the final bullet there, a couple of things that we have actually pulled back from a little bit. we are now allowing monument signs as being eligible for funding. So if you want to put a monument style sign at the entrance to your park as a design feature, that is something that we are now allowing as being eligible for legacy funding. And a similar note, we have long been champions of naturescape playgrounds. I think Carlin will attest to that. But we also recognize that sometimes some solutions require some more traditional play elements as well. So we are expanding the scope of playground elements that we will fund to include traditional playground elements, slides, swings, the different types of structures you may typically see in a schoolyard. We still strongly encourage you to make it context sensitive for what you're trying to achieve for your park. And we certainly do still fund naturescape playground elements. But now we do include those traditional playground elements, just giving you a broader scope of what you can do to bring people into your park. So that is a lot of what we have going into our funding application process this year. A lot of what's new. Again, take a look at the tutorial videos if you want to learn more about actually completing the online process. And just to kind of cover again, for those of you who may not have attended the funding application, or excuse me, the grantee required workshop back in January, there's really 3 different parts to being a successful project, the way I'm looking at it these days. First is to put together a project that you know that you can achieve within the timeline. Second is to develop the application appropriately. And the third part is to think and plan ahead for the pre-contract application or pre-contract requirements for your grant award should you be awarded. That includes all those environmental, archaeological type of work to make sure that you can get those funded and completed so that you can get your grant contract going as soon as possible. And all of that information is included on our website, in our tutorial, or on our YouTube channel, where you can also find the required grant awardee meeting video there as well. So tons of information. All of it is available online. I hope that I was able to touch on some of the changes for you so you can understand where to find stuff if you haven't been involved in the past. And yeah, we just hope that if you decide to come in for funding this year, you get in touch with us early. Let us know. Let's have a discussion about what you want to achieve, what you are hoping to apply for, and then we can help walk you through the process, help you smooth out your application or your project concept a little bit, and give you the best advantage that you can have towards being successful with your grant application. So hopefully you'll be able to be successful this year. So any questions?
Yeah,
No,
thanks,
quick
Joe.
question. Oh,
Go ahead,
go
Brad.
ahead. No,
No,
apologies.
I was just gonna open it up for questions. So you're
Yeah,
first to speak up. You get to go first.
perfect. Hey, just for a clarification, I think I know where you're going when you mentioned that 20% seasonal. You're talking about as in like one occupant for the season, not necessarily the fact that they're only available during a 6-month, 8-month period because of weather or whatever.
That is
Correct?
correct. That is correct. So if you got a campground and you allow people to move in with their RV, and
Right.
you'll see it sometimes. All of a sudden, they're putting up decks and sheds and all sorts of stuff. That's kind of what we're trying to limit a little bit more.
Yeah, and that's what I figured. I just figured I'd get a clarification. I
Good
mean, I'd be
question.
surprised if there's a lot of the public entities that are actually still holding on to a lot of seasonal stuff.
Not many.
Not many, but the ones that do there's a lot of investment in that type. There's people that have been there for decades in some cases. So
I know I'm moving away from the few that we have, and I've got some people that have been there 20 years.
Yep.
So they're real happy with me.
Yeah, very, I'm sure.
awesome.
Other questions? Go ahead and speak up, or you can enter them in the chat too. We'll keep an eye on that. Well, I have a question. With the potential additional funding and additional round of grants, do you recommend that we, for the scheduled grant solicitation, that we put in what we know there and then do it again for the second one, just in case?
Yes, best place to start is with the application that's currently. Yep.
Great.
It has the most dollars, obviously, so it's a place to start.
Sure. Okay. Thanks, Renee.
And one thing that will happen if we do open up a second round, either concurrently or later on, we've now developed their application so that it'll be the same application. It won't be a separate paper document or anything like that. It'll just be through the same portal. So it'll be more easily transferable if we need to do something with that.
And can we use the same resolution?
Oh, no.
Okay.
It's project specific.
Okay. So if we have a resolution for a project that we submitted in the first round, and then there is the second round, we need to get another resolution?
Correct.
Okay. Okay. Good. Thank you.
A good question.
Sorry, I got another one for you. I probably missed it. You've probably told me 100 times. It's just how my brain works sometimes. Looking at the eligible, like when we're looking kind of at that project eligibility guidelines. I know that first one, all infrastructure or physical development projects must have a minimum of 25,000. So when we're talking infrastructure, I guess where I'm going to, I'm just going to hypothetically use Bertram. I'm not doing anything with Bertram this year. Let's just hypothetically use Bertram. So let's say I've got 2 extra phases up there that are kind of, if you look at the master plan, that are just kind of white line, faded line. Would I be able to, say, go after a development grant to do the preliminary drawings and all that stuff for that, and then come back in another, the next year with the actual application? See where I'm going? So I'm not necessarily funding a master plan, but I'm just trying to figure out how I can do like preliminary plans and designs, if that's eligible. If it's not even eligible, then we wouldn't even mess with it.
I think, Brad, that it would be eligible. The concern I would have that it probably wouldn't be very competitive. A big chunk of our scoring is that it completes a regionally substantial component of a master plan, meaning how does it change that user experience? And something that is just that final design work doesn't necessarily impact the users at all. So that's the challenge with that type of application.
Yeah, and the only reason why I ask is, like I said, I know that we're moving more and more to wanting to see more like preliminary type designs as we do the applications. Cost of those have gone up too. So sometimes that's going to be a cost prohibitive element for people. Not necessarily saying us, I'm just thinking in terms of some others that might be a cost prohibitive element for them to be able to get to that final point to apply for the actual grant, because they might not have the funds to get the preliminary designs done either.
Yeah, and we've, as we've rolled that out over the last few years, we're finding that, yeah, it's a little bit more cost up front, but it also shows that the applicants are better prepared. And we really haven't had problems with applicants not turning in an application because of that particular issue, of not being able to get that done. It's just, most are realizing it's part of the development cycle at this point and are finding a way to get it funded. If I had a way to be able to do that, provide more of that assistance, I would know that the commission would be in favor, because they do like to see some of that skin in the game from local applicants. So
yeah, and I understand that aspect of it. And like I said, I'm not necessarily thinking for ourselves. I am and I'm not. I know that we can figure out ways, but I'm just thinking of the smaller communities that, going after a preliminary design for $20,000, $30,000 might be hard, they might need to be able to go after a grant funded for it that would help them to get that design work done, and then a few years later be able to come back after it. So again, not a big deal. It was just something I figured I would ask just to get a little more clarity on.
Yep. There's lots of ways to get that done. We've had a number, excuse me, a number of agencies, particularly when it comes to trails or some park elements, that are able to work with their city or county engineering department to do some of that work. Others are able to work through, if you work with an architect and engineering firm, sometimes they're able to build in some of the costs so that that part is lower cost. But they are kind of more guaranteed the more traditional construction and blueprint and management contracts down the road. So there's a lot of different ways for agencies to start figuring some of that out.
I have a quick question, Jennifer from Goodhue County. When we applied for our grant for our new pavilion several years ago, our design was part of our application, which isn't something that I would recommend for a project that big. It did not go very smoothly, but is that still allowable up to, I think in our case, it was like, I can't remember if it was 10 or 20% of the total cost of the project. Is that still an allowable expense?
Yes, for final design, it it absolutely is. Like we were just talking about with Brad, we do require some schematic design. Show us, what the building is generally going to look like. And a lot of that is just to make sure that you've thought through the pieces of it, what's going to fit, how's it going to fit in the landscaping. Do you have all of the required sidewalks and paths and facilities, doorways, you're generally on top of that. But the real expense that comes through final design, bid construction documents, that is an allowable expense, like you said, up to 10% for parks, 20% for trails, once it is funded.
Okay, and I was just looking through, like I said, it's been several years since we have applied. Has the timeline for the contract extended out longer than it was several years ago? I was thinking it was only 2 years, but I was just scrolling through quickly and I thought now it looks like it's 3.
Jennifer, it's always been 3 years, but sometimes when Dan Gollner does the contracts, oddly, and I don't think it would have applied to you, he always started off on a 2-year contract, even though it's 3. And I don't know why that is, but everyone is on board now at DNR contract administration. It's a 3-year grant.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I don't see any more questions in the chat, so I'll give one last call for questions.
Well, maybe if I could, Gina,
Yeah.
maybe, is there anything that you as applicants would want to share with us as the commission? Things for us to be thinking about. What are some things that are being successful for you? Questions about specific projects that might spur ideas for other people. We're open to those sorts of discussions or questions that go beyond just the nuts and bolts of the funding application too, or just tell some stories about what's working or not working, because sometimes we can react to that in different ways too.
Oh, thanks for that offer. I can kick us off. One of the aspirations that we've got for 2 inlets at Badehe Haka Omash Kusagans Regional Park is to develop a cultural landscape co-management and messaging plan. It would be a process led by an outside consulting firm that would involve tribal partners, our team at the county, and other stakeholders that would really set the parameters for designated use on the landscape, how partners work together to co-manage, co-steward the landscape, and then what is the narrative that's going to be shared there, and how. So I see it as a really critical tool as we move forward intentionally and thoughtfully to make the landscape more available to visitors. And so I'm wondering, it was going through my mind, is if that would be a competitive application for the grant associated with archaeological and environmental work or not. And then my concern with the 3-year term is that the plan would definitely take 3 years. I don't know how long it would take. Just in my experience with doing like a traditional cultural landscape survey, that was supposed to be a 1-year process and it took almost 2. So I hesitate a little bit with a tight timeline. So
Right.
anyway.
That is a great question. I think that would be a fascinating process. And you've already, you've taken great leaps already in sort of setting the groundwork to be able to do any of that type of work. Yeah, I think that would be a possibility for the environmental classification. It could also potentially be within the scope and framework for a regular grant as well, for development. Every master plan has to have programming and interpretation as a part of it, which you certainly do, and further developing and refining that could potentially be a part of that. It's one of those things, we like new ideas, so feel free to put it in the mix. Let's keep talking about it, figure out how it fits, and if we have to, tweak things from one category to the next, as it gets developed or submitted, we're open to that.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Any other questions for us? Or ideas?
Do you have kind of an idea of a maximum grant size? I mean,
Or
For development?
yeah,
Yeah, our average definitely went up last year. It bumped from just under $1 million to about $1.4 million across our entire funded grant awards. I would say for most agencies, that's a pretty good sized project. Some obviously can have the capacity or have the facilities to do larger projects than that, which we're open to. We still do not have a maximum size. Just recognize that if we're looking at a $12 million grant across the entire, or grant pool across the entire state, if you come in on the larger side, chances go up that we may ask you to phase it. So, which means that we cut your ask down, work with you on that, and then you can come back later for the rest of the grant as the next year's application. So just keep that in mind, that if you are coming in for a larger grant, think ahead of time about how you might phase that should we come back and ask for that. So that'd be my real advice on that sort of question.
that's good. I'm not planning on applying for a huge grant. I just noticed that the average grant award went up. And so I was curious if the commission had a concept of maximum size. So thanks, Joe.
So I can kind of chime in on that, as from my perspective. I have had commissioners pushing me to go for like way more funding than what I had ever seen as a grant request. And so I had to kind of push back a little bit on my own county commissioners and be like, it's split into 6 districts. And if I ask for all of the funding in my district, but then also think that I'm going to be taking funding from the other districts if we go with the general idea that we try and spread it equally statewide. I was like, we're not playing very nice at that point. So to me, I kind of just on the off chance that we're the only one in the district that's applying, we could potentially take all the funding in that area. But I just tell my commissioners, I was like, I won't apply for generally more than the 1/6 breakdown of grant funding, just because I think it's kind of a little overzealous compared to, you know, there's a lot of good projects around the state. So that was my own kind of boundary that I set with myself and my commissioners. Otherwise, they would have told us to go for, you know, $5-6 million on our project. And that just felt a little greedy to me personally.
I love that, Carlin. Thanks for sharing that. Well, and I think too, it speaks to, you know, the long-term integrity of the funding being available. I would think that policymakers would like to see it distributed around the state.
Bear in mind too that it's never an equal distribution, and we don't have metrics where we divide it out that way. I mean, Carlin was thinking broadly, and that's great. I agree with you, Gina. Thank you for pushing back on that and allowing funding in other places. We recognize, you know, some districts like District 4 have a lot of facilities. You've got 22 of them, I think. Other districts like District 2 have 9 now or 8. So just by the nature of people, facilities applying for things, it's not an even application cycle every year because some districts just don't have as many. What we do track over time is the number of applications totally applied for in a district and the number of awards made. And that actually looks on par pretty good, that there's a large number of applications over time. There, of course, have more awards, but if there aren't a lot of applications, also there aren't a lot of awards. So it helps legislators understand that we're not simply giving all the money to a district. They just have had more facilities, more applications, and as a percentage, the smaller districts actually, or smaller facilities numbers in districts have done okay, but there's never been a hard and fast, we're only going to allow this much. The legislation actually says that over time, you know, this will weigh out, or something to that effect. It takes into account that not everybody's going to be ready to apply at the same time.
Ben's not on here, so I'm going to say it's all Stearns County.
I would counter that to say that it's a tie between Wright and Stearns County.
Oh.
Being a fellow District 4.
All we know is if you don't apply, for sure you're not going to get a grant. So
That's
Yeah.
right.
So I was going to bounce off like I agree with Carlin's approach in a lot of ways, but I know that on our end, there's been times that we try to be prepared. We'll throw the big ask, and then we already have it broke down on our end for the prepared eye. If they come back to us, how we can phase it, so we're ready for that answer. I think it kind of shows the need. Hey, this is where we're at. This is where we're going, and then we leave it to the commission to kind of tell us, hey, it's too big. Can you pare it down? Can you look at something different? And then we'll go from there. It's not necessarily a greed thing. It's just more of this is what the need is, and here it is, and then we'll go from there and be ready to phase out when we need to phase out. Well, because I know Joe and Renee have no problem telling us nope. In a good way.
I don't like to think we say it quite like that.
In a good way.
Brad, it's not that we fight every year over who gets to call you and tell you no or anything.
Like I said, it's all in a good way. We just have fun.
I have one more question to follow up on the potential for the additional $1.8 million in that round of applications. Do you have a sense for when that would be best and worst case scenario? Or does
Well-
it completely depend on the legislative session?
We won't know until everything is signed, sealed, and delivered, of course, for the largest. So we had 33,000 set aside, which in the big scheme of things, of course, isn't a lot of money as the emerging opportunities, but we'll have a pretty clear sense of where these bills are going, fairly soon. They're keeping to a pretty tight timeline, as you know. We're not going to, Joe and I have talked a lot about how do we roll out a second round of grants without totally confusing ourselves and everybody else about how you apply for the second round of grants. So we're sensitive to that also. I think we've somewhat agreed that we're leaning towards closing down one round and then opening up the second one, but making it a shorter time frame. So that there's not that long runway to apply for a grant. It's a shorter time frame so that we can make a decision on them and award them in a quick amount of time, also recognizing these are probably projects you want to get off, especially if it's connecting people with the outdoor or acquisition somewhere, or you need additional funds for a project that just ran over budget. So probably not at the same time, and for sure a shorter time frame to make that decision. Joe, I think we're in agreement.
So will they be decided on at the same time though? Will there still be the same grant contract cycle of determining who's going to get the grants in like that November, December timeframe, and then got all of the grant contracts are signed the following July?
You wouldn't have to wait till the following July because these funds free up on July 1 of this year. So those funds are available to be spent now. So
Yeah.
our hope would be to get them out the door right away. Whereas the other funds can't be spent till a year from now or more. So these would be decided on, awarded, contracted, and out quickly. Because they only have a 2-year time frame to be spent also.
That's a good clarification to make sure that people understand when they're applying for that grant. Then I
Yeah.
think too, is that
Because they
there's
go
two-
back to last, well, actually, they go back a year, so they were available to be spent last year. It gets confusing with the bienniums, but yeah, let's just call it 2 years on all of it.
That's helpful. Thank you. Any other questions for Joe and Renee?
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is really valuable. And we'll get the recording posted on our website and sent out in our newsletter. And really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Have a
all.
great day, everybody. Enjoy the
Thanks
snow
so
or
much.
rain.
Are you guys getting rain?
Thank you.
Carlin
South
is.
Rain. Yeah.
Carlin.
Owatonna getting rain.
So it's that south break.
Yep.
We have a little mix going.